take the example of an empty chair. If you have an empty chair, you can say, there sits an invisible man. Now, how can you prove that there is no man, invisible man, in the empty chair? Quite obviously, if the chair is empty, is that there is room for somebody. Now, if you would sit on the chair, you would say, well, he's not that stupid. He moved just before you sat in. So it doesn't prove that he wasn't in before. And you can run around and always say, the invisible man has done this, and has done that, and that. Which allows you also to switch argument, because the fact that the chair is empty becomes a proof that there is an invisible man.
The OSS became the CIA in 1947 as Reinhard Gehlen's spy network in Europe flourished, ostensibly under its control. In the Far East, Field Operations Intelligence was established in the late 40s to augment CIA special military operations. It was supposed to report to the Office of the Assistant Chief for Army Intelligence. But General Douglas MacArthur and his head of military intelligence, Charles Willoughby, didn't trust the CIA. Even at this early stage, they feared Soviet penetration. So Willoughby created his own CIA in South Korea, a secret police force renowned for its ruthlessness. Fearing the possibility of another world war, President Harry Truman fired the loose cannon MacArthur in 1951. Willoughby went back to the States with the general and immediately connected with Joe McCarthy, providing him with intelligence as the witch hunt for Reds continued. Meanwhile, Field Operations Intelligence continued in the 50s as a covert extension of CIA policies and activities to conceal the true nature of CIA objectives. For example, men like Colonel John Stanley were responsible for collecting intelligence in denied areas. The National Police Agency in the Far East developed into a network based in Korea. Meanwhile, back in the States, Charles Willoughby's circle widened during the 50s to include other right-wing groups who were determined to stop the spread of communism at any cost. Guatemala, 1954. With the help of the Catholic Church, the CIA staged the coup codenamed Operation Success in the interests of the United Fruit Company. Or was this just a popular uprising?
The Americans, of course, have been accused of overthrowing this duly elected president, Arbenz. He was elected, though after rather odd goings-on. The leading contender for the presidency of Guatemala actually had been murdered, assassinated in an attack with, I've forgotten if it was rifles or machine guns, in circumstances that left considerable grounds for suspicion that Arbenz's people were behind the operation. So that perhaps is not what we think of as an entirely free and above-board election. When you know, if let us say Bill Clinton had had President Bush assassinated before the last presidential election in the U.S., or vice versa, if Bush had had Clinton assassinated, we might consider the outcome of the election somewhat tainted. There was fear not just of American investments in Guatemala being lost, but fear also of the kind of thing that happened with Castro later. That is, that the Soviet bloc might get a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And there were indications of arms coming from the Soviet bloc to Guatemala. So there were reasonable geopolitical grounds as a precautionary measure to overthrow that government.
Vietnam, 1955. The U.S. gave $216 million in aid to South Vietnam. The CIA special operations were already in motion.
The Chinese were planning not to send in their own forces into Indochina, but to give extensive aid and advisors, some kind of personnel, not combat personnel, but advisors to Ho Chi Minh's communist forces or Viet Minh forces fighting against the French in Vietnam and elsewhere in Indochina. So out of the armistice in Korea comes the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. One follows from the other. There was a close connection between the Korean and Indo-Chinese theaters of war, and in fact some of the French military people felt betrayed by the Americans. The Americans had made a separate peace in Korea, unleashing communist power to turn against the French. And the communists won at Dien Bien Phu because they had a lot of heavy artillery and anti-aircraft guns and so on that had come from China, weapons the Chinese might otherwise have been using in Korea. The Americans had begun to get involved in Vietnam a little bit even before the Korean War, but especially after the Korean War broke out, the Americans made a major commitment to support the French war effort in Vietnam.
The Sputnik Scare, 1957. Were the Soviets superior in missiles? Nikita Khrushchev challenged Ike to a shooting match in November.
The Soviets had created the impression, in the eyes of the Chinese at least, and in the eyes of many people, in the latter part of the 1950s, that the Soviets had strategic missile superiority over the United States. In 1957, the Soviets had tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, before the Americans had. And they had launched the famous Sputnik, the first Earth satellite, in October of '57. The Chinese read far more into these Soviet space spectaculars than they really should have. And the Chinese started arguing that the Soviet Union had strategic supremacy over the American imperialists. And the Chinese drew from this the logical deduction. If the Soviets have this supremacy, they can safely support China and the global communist cause in general in a vigorous offensive against the imperialists. We can really throw the imperialists around now, the Chinese were saying. We have this superiority through the Soviet missile power. Now, of course, this was very embarrassing for Khrushchev because he knew the Soviet missile power was a bluff. They had tested an ICBM, but they had very few operational weapons. As late as the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, they put missiles in Cuba, the shorter-range missiles in Cuba, because they did not have enough long-range missiles to threaten the U.S. effectively from Soviet territory. So they needed to have shorter-range missiles in Cuba. So the Soviets realized that their strength was a bluff, and they had reason to suspect the Americans knew it was a bluff, because they knew, the Soviets knew, that the American U-2 reconnaissance planes were flitting around over the Soviet Union periodically. The Soviets could detect the U-2s on radar, but the Soviet fighters could not climb high enough, the Soviet missiles could not get high enough to shoot down U-2, not until 1960.
At Sugi Air Base, Japan, 1957. The CIA recruited a radar operator named Lee Oswald for special intelligence operations. Atsugi served as one of 2 overseas field stations where the agency conducted extensive LSD testing. Former CIA finance officer James Wilcott told the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977 Oswald was paid by the CIA while still stationed at Atsugi. The CIA had 201 files on Oswald. They filled 2 4-drawer safes, and his tax records for that year remain classified.